For decades, the world operated under a comforting illusion that natural resources were abundant, renewable, and always within reach. But beneath the surface, a slow-burning crisis has been unfolding. Nations are waking up to a harsh truth. The resources that built modern civilization are shrinking faster than they can be replenished. This isn't a prediction for the distant future. It's happening now, quietly, almost invisibly. The pressure begins with population growth and explosive industrial demand, especially from emerging superpowers. Every year, billions consume more water, more minerals, more energy, and more food than nature can regenerate. The world's most essential materials, lithium, copper, rare earths, freshwater, fertile soil, are slipping into structural scarcity. The competition for what remains is no longer economic. It is becoming geopolitical. But the real danger is not the lack of resources. It is the impossible math of a global system built on endless growth, trying to function in a world of shrinking supplies. Governments understand this. Corporations understand this. Only the citizens remain in the dark. As scarcity deepens, powerful nations are shifting strategies. They are no longer relying solely on trade, partnerships, or markets. Instead, they are securing strategic resources at the source, locking down mines, farmlands, waterways, ports, and energy corridors around the globe. The lines between economic policy and national security are blurring. From Africa to South America to the Arctic, a quiet scramble is underway. Countries are stockpiling, restricting exports, nationalizing assets, and preparing for a future where resources, not technology or currency, determine dominance. This is the silent beginning of the coming resource lockdown, and the world is only just starting to feel its consequences. Around the world, quiet but alarming shortages are reshaping how nations think about survival. These shortages are not sudden accidents. They are the result of decades of overconsumption, ecological damage, geopolitical tension, and fragile supply chains that were built for profit, not stability. As demand continues to rise and resources grow more strained, powerful nations are beginning to view basic materials not as market goods, but as strategic weapons. Food, water, energy, minerals, rare earth metals. Each of these is now transforming into a point of leverage. For example, freshwater scarcity is no longer limited to deserts. Major rivers are shrinking, groundwater is collapsing, and clean water access is becoming a bargaining chip between regions. Countries reliant on imported grain or fertilizers are suddenly realizing that a single geopolitical conflict can threaten their entire food security. Energy markets are no different. The world's transition to renewable technology has created massive demand for lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare minerals, resources controlled by only a handful of nations. As these supplies tighten, governments are no longer comfortable leaving them in the hands of foreign corporations or global markets. This fear is driving policies that would have seemed impossible a decade ago. Aggressive nationalization, export bans, expanded military presence around mines, and strategic stockpiling at unprecedented levels. Even everyday goods, microchips, medicines, essential metals, are facing shortages. When global supply chains cracked during recent crises, governments realized the uncomfortable truth. They could no longer rely on other nations to keep their societies functioning. This is the true hidden crisis. Shortages are not merely economic problems. They are becoming triggers for political instability, international conflict, and domestic panic. And as scarcity deepens, nations will move toward more extreme, forceful measures to secure what they need. As the world enters an era of shrinking supplies and rising demand, nations are no longer competing through diplomacy or trade agreements alone. They are entering a new, aggressive race for direct control over natural resources. This race is not loud or dramatic. It is subtle, strategic, and deeply calculated. Behind closed doors, governments are quietly securing access to the commodities that will define survival in the coming decades: fresh water, rare earth minerals, fertile land, energy reserves, and even strategic metals used in technology. Countries with strong economies are rapidly purchasing mines, farmlands, and energy fields in weaker or politically unstable regions. They present these deals as development partnerships, but in reality, They are long-term land and resource grabs that give the stronger nation complete leverage over local production. For example, farmland acquisition has surged across Africa and South America. These lands often grow food not for local populations, but for foreign governments preparing for shortages. Similarly, rare earth minerals, essential for electronics, batteries, and military hardware, have become a geopolitical weapon. Nations with large reserves are restricting exports, while others are scrambling to secure long-term supply chains through ownership rather than trade. Energy-rich regions are witnessing the same shift. Pipelines, oil fields, and lithium deposits are now battlegrounds for dominance rather than mere commercial assets. This global rush is driven by a simple truth. When supply chains fracture, only the countries that directly control the raw material will survive without chaos. Those dependent on imports will face shortages, price spikes, and political instability. The world is quietly dividing into resource-rich fortresses and resource-dependent territories. And as this divide widens, the coming resource lockdown becomes not just a possibility, but an inevitability. As the global population continues to grow and climate change exacerbates scarcity, governments are increasingly seeing their natural resources not as public goods, but as strategic assets. Water, rare minerals, energy reserves, and fertile land are no longer just tools for domestic use. They have become levers of geopolitical power. Nations that control these resources can dictate the terms of trade, influence global markets, and gain significant leverage over weaker countries. This shift is already visible in moves to nationalize critical industries. Countries rich in lithium, cobalt, and other essential minerals for technology and energy production are imposing stricter export controls and creating state-backed corporations to consolidate control. Similarly, water-rich nations are beginning to recognize the potential of freshwater as a strategic commodity, prompting regulations on foreign ownership of water-intensive agricultural and industrial operations. The implications for citizens are profound. Governments may restrict access to certain goods or services domestically to ensure strategic reserves are maintained for national security. Internationally, countries could leverage resource control to negotiate favorable trade deals or to exert political pressure. For instance, a nation controlling rare earth elements could manipulate supply to extract concessions from technology-dependent economies. Moreover, this trend is not limited to developing nations. Advanced economies are also stockpiling critical resources, investing in domestic production, and rethinking long-term supply chain dependencies. In essence, resource ownership is transitioning from a market-driven dynamic to a state-controlled strategy, where geopolitical considerations overshadow free market principles. By understanding this emerging reality, individuals and businesses can anticipate potential shortages, policy shifts, and price spikes. The coming resource lockdown is not merely a distant possibility. It is a strategic imperative for nations seeking survival and influence in a world of dwindling natural abundance. The final phase of the resource lockdown is likely to be the most disruptive: outright state control and prioritization of strategic resources over market demand. Governments will increasingly implement strict regulations, rationing, and tariffs to safeguard national interests. Citizens may experience higher prices, limited availability of essential goods, and even restricted access to resources previously taken for granted. This shift will also redefine global trade. Countries dependent on imported materials will be forced to renegotiate contracts, diversify suppliers, or invest heavily in domestic production. Nations with abundant resources will gain disproportionate geopolitical influence, using their control as leverage in international negotiations and alliances. In effect, the global economy may fragment into resource blocks, where access is determined less by money and more by strategic alignment. Private companies, particularly in sectors like energy, agriculture, and technology, will also face new realities. They may need to partner with governments, comply with tighter regulations, or risk losing access to critical inputs. Innovation will still occur, but under the shadow of national priorities and strategic stockpiles. For individuals, the era of abundant, cheap, and freely available resources is coming to an end. Planning ahead, whether through alternative investments, sustainable practices, or self-sufficiency strategies, will become essential. The coming resource lockdown is not merely a geopolitical maneuver. It is an inevitable response to scarcity, environmental pressures, and the rising recognition that natural assets are the ultimate foundation of power in the 21st century.